Okay, it looks like we've got several new people on. Again, my name is Richard Long with MHA Consulting. We're glad to have you all on our webinar today, and hope that this becomes an enjoyable and hopefully informative session. We're going to go ahead and get started. One of the things we try to believe in is getting started on time and ending on time. So we want to go ahead and do that, and hopefully it won't be too bad. We'll get through some of the introductory items, and then we'll go from there. As I had mentioned before we get started, for the majority of the session, we're going to go ahead and mute everyone, and then at appropriate times I'll unmute it so that we can ask questions if necessary. So if you do have any questions, you can wait till we do that.
To continue any ongoing investigations. Look, the bottom line is any investigation that was happening on.
So with that, let's go ahead and get started. The session for today, we're going to talk about business impact analyses and how do we do those as efficiently as possible. Sometimes these are can be time consuming, and sometimes they're not as time consuming. But I think one of the things that we want to make sure we get out of this is efficiency does not necessarily mean short time frame. It does mean getting things done as effectively and getting the information out. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So with that, just a quick introduction of MHA. If you don't know who we are, we've been around for about 18 years. Our consulting members all have about, on average, 15 years. A lot of us have got a little bit more than that. I joke with people, the only reason I have a bald head is because I don't want people to see all the gray in my head and in my beard. So try to make myself look a little bit younger. But we've all been around, 15 plus years myself. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And we kind of go across the entire business continuity space, as you can kind of see there. And we do have some SaaS-based tools for compliance reporting and analysis, as well as an overall risk analysis tool that we'll talk maybe a little bit about as appropriate. This is just kind of a smattering of our client profile. You can see it goes across many of the verticals, from consumers to the government and public sector, as well as healthcare services, financial, education, et cetera. So we've kind of gone across, kind of have a good understanding of many of the verticals and a lot of the processes that impact organizations as a whole. Even though business continuity, concepts are the same, sometimes there are those very specific needs that company have, and so we really do kind of bring that. As we kind of talked about our overall practice, you can see from assessing the environments to coming up with strategies and solutions, helping with any kind of documentation and implementation of programs, and then helping with exercises. And then probably, once we get there, is the part that often organizations struggle with is the maintenance and improvement side, which is really kind of, as we talk about, business impact assessments and threat and risk assessments, keeping those up to date and making sure that all of that time and effort that we place and that good information stays current. So we look forward to working with organizations to keep that up as well. And if you have any questions on these, following the presentation, we'll be happy to answer them, or following up to that, we're always happy to talk to folks about what we do and how we might be able to help you, or just questions you have. We're very open to taking a little bit of time to helping you with your questions, just as a service and as trying to be a good partner with everybody in the community. So, what are we going to try to accomplish today? So really it's, effective business impact assessments, right? Planning for the BIA. Who are the right people to participate? How do we actually go about doing it? The logistics of the analysis. Then, great, we've got it. We all know we're supposed to do them. How do we actually use that that information and what can it be beneficial, especially outside potentially of business continuity and our actual role in the traditional BIA and using that for our recovery strategies or our plan. Hopefully that's what we'll be able to accomplish. For us, it's very important that we always take a look at the big picture. One of my favorite quotes is, where there is no vision, there is no success. If we don't know what the big picture is, if we don't know where we're going, as from Alice in Wonderland, you don't know where you're going. It really doesn't matter what path you're going to take. And so when we look at this, it's all about risk and resilience, and how do we balance the risk versus all of the other things that we put in place, compliance and readiness and maturity and everything else, so that we're actually a resilient organization. And at MHA, one of our big mantras is making sure that we're functional, and that whatever we actually do will work in a real event, not just in a test and not just on paper. And so that it's more than just checking off a box that we've done it. So just to make sure, and I'm sure this group is well aware, but so that we're kind of all on the same page as we talk about our business impact analyses, recovery time objectives versus recovery point objectives, and the idea of an objective versus an actual. In many of your organizations, I'm sure you're using the recovery time objective and looking at those. Often we find that organizations are using less of the recovery time actual and making that comparison of, what is my actual recovery time? So, the recovery time objective is the desired state. How quickly does a process or an application need to be functional again from a business requirements perspective? And then the recovery time actual is, what's the current actual capability? A lot of times, we go into these assessments, as we're going to talk about, and come up with these numbers, but the reality is we can't meet them. And so understanding the difference between what we feel we need and what's actually capable is not always known. Similarly, on the recovery point objective, that is a data loss number, right? So, and this is really more related to less about process and more about the specific applications utilized by those processes. When an application or a process is up and functioning, again, from any type of emergency event or outage event, how much data can that process or application lose, and the appropriate process can recreate that data, or it can just be lost because it really wasn't that important. And very quickly, the example I like to use to tie those together is the corporate website, kind of the presence to the public. Often the corporate website has a very low recovery time objective, right? It might be minutes because we can't ever be off of the internet. We always have to have a presence. So the RTO may be minutes. But the RPO, the amount of data loss from that website, could be 24 hours or maybe even 48 hours because the data is relatively static and it's relatively easy to recreate. So it might have a long or short RPO or RTO and a very long RPO. And then those can be reversed or kind of be the same in a transactional system like an Amazon. That has a very low RTO, can't ever be down, and a very low RPO because there's no way to recreate the data. So kind of with that kind of piece, what is a business impact analysis, right? Just so that we're all on the same page, because sometimes we confuse, people will confuse this idea, and they'll focus more on application-centric analyses rather than technology or process-based. And so when we look at business impact analyses, we always look at it from a process assessment, not an application, not a technology base. We'll talk a little bit about different options and how to maybe make these things a little bit quicker. But from the pure standpoint is we want to make sure that we focus on processes. Also, we want to determine what a process needs to be functional following an event. Not necessarily just barely up and running, but what we would call basic production-like functional. In between time, we have business impact or business continuity plans that help us kind of move along or limp along, if you will, while the applications and everything's being recovered again. But from an impact assessment, how quickly does it need to be fully functional again? And again, this is a time-sensitive measurement, not an importance to the organization measurement. And that's something I really wanted to get up front, kind of from this presentation. And when we do business BIAs, that's something in our introduction that we make sure people understand, that it's time sensitivity, not a relative level of importance. When people understand that, we tend to get better answers. And often I will use an example of the CEO of an organization. The CEO of an organization is incredibly important, but a lot of times that what he does or she does is not time sensitive. And so if the CEO is gone for a month, the organization continues to function. But if the CEO is gone for 6, 7, 8, a year, now the organization starts having problems. And you can reverse that. A call center has might have 100 people in it, and if the call center goes down, that's a big deal. They've got to be up very, very quickly because that's the face of the organization. That's where customers are calling. And yet, and they're still very important to the organization, but the individuals there may turn over. And so you really have to look at it from that perspective, and that it really is time sensitivity versus importance. Everybody's important to the organization. Otherwise, we wouldn't be there. We also want to make sure we're determining dependencies, both internal and external, not just time sensitivity of when an application is up. We allow this and we use this to find technology that supports the processes. And often these BIAs, as I'm sure you're all aware, will help identify those technologies that maybe people don't really know are being leveraged. We'll be sitting there, and it's easy to get the big ones, right? Your ERP, your accounting system, the website, Exchange. We could probably sit down and put very big categories that just about every process would leverage. But you sit down and start talking about it and understand the processes, and now you start finding, oh yeah, there's this really important Access database that's been running for the last 15 years that nobody really knows is out there. Or there's this SaaS solution that the department went and purchased that they're leveraging that nobody else knew about because it's easy to go buy a cloud-based solution. So identifying those technologies that are truly important, or maybe are not understood to be as important. The file server is, we don't use file servers for important data, but it turns out a certain process has started to do that in the last year. So that technology aspect can be very valuable. Also determining what manual processes could be used if the technology is available, or the reverse is what we're finding more and more now is that there are no manual processes. The assumption is, oh yeah, that's not a problem. We could do that manually, when in reality, it makes no sense. A good example of that is I was in a retail store a couple months ago, and their POS systems were down, so their registers weren't down. I went in, the lines were now, it was taking like 30 minutes to check out. And on top of that, if you wanted to pay with a credit card, the only thing they had were the old style slide image credit cards. And I was like, forget it, I'm out of here. And not only was it that, it was carbon based. Like, I'm not staying, I'm out of here. And so their manual process in reality wasn't really a true functional manual process. So the BIA will help us understand that. And then one of the things now in our state that's extremely important is determining the state of hard copy data. We think everything's online until you sit down and understand that maybe within a supply chain organization, they keep hard copies of their way bills. They keep hard copies of their import-export forms that are needed for certain audits that were just assumed were no longer there, but could use the data on the systems. So you're probably all aware of that, but some of these things often get glossed over. I'm going to unmute everybody for a moment and see if there are any questions as we kind of start on the business impact side of it. Okay, going to go ahead and mute everybody again. And so now from a strategies perspective, as we get into that, you know, a formal interview that we'll talk we'll talk a little bit about as we move forward. You know, those are typically 1 to 2 hours per department where we sit down with a very formal questionnaire. There might be an online tool that goes through this, where we interview and do a lot of scoring. That's kind of what we often think about in terms of, you know, a BIA. And, you know, you'll go through identifying the categories and scoring and really understanding the processes before we even go through that process. And we'll talk a little bit about that preparation. That's one idea. The next one is kind of an informal interview where you still go through kind of that assessment or that analysis, but you kind of do it more back of the envelope, or you kind of have more of just a conversation where you can then infer a lot of the data from there. It might just be, hey, if this process isn't available, you know, what's the revenue impact, and do you have any cost impact? And you can kind of lead people down down that path rather than it being a very formal multi-individual session. The next one that we have leveraged that isn't quite as effective as the first two is really a questionnaire where you send it out and just have people answer the questions, give them some very detailed instructions, and they fill all of the information out, send it back, and then there's kind of a back and forth either through email or quick phone calls to determine the information. And then you might do something kind of a hybrid where you might send a questionnaire out and then do, you know, a 30-minute interview, as we talked about, and clarify or kind of update the information as necessary. I think it's probably pretty clear or obvious that to get the best information, the formal interview, the one that, you know, you spend an hour or two per department, focusing very much on all of the processes, is really the most effective from a data collection perspective. And understanding what the entire gamut of what we talked about, from time sensitivity to the process, to technology, dependencies, hard copy items, all of those type of things. That really does take kind of a formal interview and at least a lot of more time to get that information. The other ones, you can gather some of that, but often you don't have the time to get into the details and do some of the challenging that is required within the interview that we'll talk a little bit about. So the next step is, so is that kind of in our preparation, is what type of BIA do you need to do? Where are you at? You know, as we work with organizations, we will often come in and say, you know, they say, we need a BIA. And of course, our first discussion is, well, what are you trying to accomplish? What do we need to pull out of this BIA? And we'll look at it and say, you know, typically you're looking at a couple hours per department, 2 to 2.5, plus maybe 15 to 30 minutes of preparation time. You know, and you start adding that up, and now you're looking at, you know, 100, 200 hours plus a report, and, you know, all of these things, and it gets can get large and feel daunting, especially from a big organization perspective. You know, as an example, a year or so ago, I sat down with a very large organization within the insurance industry, and we did their entire organization from a BIA perspective. Took us 3 months to get through all of the BIAs, multiple trips out to their headquarters, you know, 6-8 hour days of sitting down with departments and some follow-up. But it took a lot of time. Got a lot of great information and have been leveraging that. Some organizations just can't take that time. And one of the things that we want to tell people is something is better than nothing. So instead of looking at it and saying, we just can't do it, so we're going to not do a BIA. Well, as we talked about, there's multiple options. We can at least do a back of the envelope. We can at least do a quick gut check, a 15-minute conversation with heads of departments to understand. So the first thing is really determining what type of BAA do I need to do. And those questions are around what's the organization tolerance for time and effort and training and follow-up, right? And part of that might also be, when was the last BIA? If you just did a BIA a year ago, probably don't need to go through and do a formal BIA that's going to take 2 or 3 hours per department. A questionnaire may be enough, or a quick interview may be enough, just to make sure that things haven't changed and probe a little bit. So really kind of take a look at that. And again, back from our perspective of something's better than nothing, and a quick back of the envelope BIA of at least understanding your basic recovery time objective and recovery point objectives, you're 80% of the way there. Then you can circle back and get some of the other information. Now, determining your RTO and RPOs. This is one, as we prepare and work with organizations, sometimes this takes a little bit more time, in that people want to get very, very granular. And so we look at it in terms of, and you can kind of see here, in these 2 examples, we've pretty much got 6 RTOs and 5 RPOs. That's probably about the most we ever recommend organizations leverage. You don't necessarily want to get down into the 0 and 2 hours and 4 hours and 6 hours and 8 hours, and the next thing you know, you've got 15 RTOs. There's not a whole lot of value in doing that from the standpoint of the BIA. The focus of the RTOs and RPOs from our perspective is helps us understand in broader categories ultimately what the recovery strategy required will be. And also, what is the data backup, replication, and all of those other items from the standpoint of data loss. We will then, if folks want to go more than 5 or 6 of these, especially as it relates to some of the longer RTOs, like an RTO 5, for example, that might be greater than 30 days. Well, that's a big number, right? Well, what does greater than 30 days mean? 60, 90, 120, etc. So, or even in some of these other RTOs where it might go from 5 days to 10 days. Well, what does that mean? Because people might think in terms of, well, 10 days is too long, but 5 days is too short. So in our BIAs, as we determine these, we will let folks know we can always be a little bit more refined as we go through and understand them. But from the standpoint of understanding business impact, we want to make sure we understand in these more broad categories. Then as we sit down and discuss it, if somebody says, yeah, you know what, I'm an RTO 4, which is 10 days or less. But 10 days is really too long, and I really need to be up in 6 or 7 days. Okay, well, we'll note that in the BIA, that this process really needs to be available in 6 or 7 days. Then you can refine things down if you need to after the interview as you look at that, as opposed to trying to spend the time determining, well, are you a 4-hour RTO or are you a 6-hour RTO? The reality is those are pretty much the same from a recovery perspective. And often as you go through these analyses, it will become very clear that, you know what, you're not quite 5 days, or you're not really a 5-day, but man, 10 really is long. And you'll know that it's got to be somewhere in between. So sitting down and understanding it and spending the time is really important to determine those. And just don't make them too long, or your BIA will take a lot longer. So this really does help the efficiency. Are there any questions or any comments that anybody would like to make at this point? It's a good place to stop.
Sure, I would ask a question to talk about the recovery time objective. And by the way, this is Rick from Jefferson City, Missouri. The recovery time objectives, you mentioned you have 5 objectives, but really there are 6. And I'm having a hard time understanding the differences between an RTO 0 and an RTO 1 when it comes to time.
Okay. Yeah, so I kind of took some out of here. So the difference between these RTOs are going to be the time sensitivity. So an RTO 0 might be less than 4 hours of recovery. An RTO 1 might be a 12-hour or less recovery. And then you might move yourself up to an RTO 2 being 36 hours. An RTO 3 might be 5 days. An RTO 4 may be 14 days. And then an RTO 5 might be greater than 14 days, or it might be greater than 30 days. So those are the timeframes in which a process needs to be available. Does that help?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, okay, yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And that again is kind of where we're saying, from the standpoint of determining what those numbers should be, based on your business, we may or may not be able to tell you up front. Not every organization is going to have the same RTO values. I'm gonna mute everybody again here just a second. I'll unmute you in just a moment. So kind of to follow up on that is, the reason we don't necessarily put recommended times is we don't know from the standpoint of your business what the appropriate ones may be. Some organizations might have an RTO 0 that is zero downtime because of certain processes that they know can't ever be down. Think of an Amazon, for example. Whereas other organizations may know that we don't have an immediate recovery business model. We have one that's 12 hours. We're just in the middle of doing some BIAs for an organization, and that is the case. Their RTO 0 is actually 12 hours or less, because across the board, they can actually be down for some level of hours, kind of a business day, if you will, and still be okay, even of their most critical processes, as opposed to larger organizations that might be financially transaction oriented. Well, those typically are very, very short, maybe in the the less than an hour or the minutes perspective. Are there any other comments or questions on that to be more clear? Okay. So the next one is kind of determining now kind of the scope of your BIA. This, maybe is obvious. I mean, if you're going to do all of your departments, then it's easy. We're just going to go and grab all departments. But even within all of the departments, there may be a whittling down of critical processes that you want to deal with. But even if it's that, maybe you may look at it and say, you know what, we can't do every department in this first round. We don't have the time. We don't have the capacity, whatever that reason may be. And so you may identify critical departments. Maybe your supply chain is always one that you're going to do, and the financial group or the customer service and sales. Those you want to make sure there, because that's really kind of the lifeblood of the organization. From an insurance perspective, it could be underwriting and claims. You've got to make sure those are included, maybe as well as the finance group, because of the necessary funding and cash flow that needs to be done. But for right now, we know that accounting isn't quite as critical, or maybe some of the other functions, marketing, we're not as worried about that right now. That's something you'll have to determine. We always recommend that more is better, but if you can determine those critical departments, those you may consider for a very formal BIA, where you're going to spend those couple hours getting into the details. And then the other departments, you may just do more of an informal, quick conversation of time sensitivity. How quickly do you need to be up? And that unless a department comes and says, we've got to be up in immediately. Well, and I'll use AP as an example. Typically, accounts payable up front, they'll say, we're good for 3 to 5 days, right? And if an accounts payable group says, we got to be up immediately, there's a question, because that's not normal. Might be needed, and I never want to say that it's wrong, but you kind of look at it from an overall perspective, and you can challenge things. But if it's close and it seems right, then you can kind of leave it for maybe some of those less time-sensitive departments. And that will really help kind of the efficiencies you kind of gather down from an initial BIA, what do you really need to try to accomplish, and who do you need to drive to. The next step is working with those departments to identify who's going to participate. Sometimes this is kind of a mixed bag. It's either not enough people or way too many. It's helpful to have individuals who are both from a kind of a management and individual contributor perspective. You want to make sure that there's the understanding of how the process actually fits in the organization as a whole, and not just individuals who, this is my job and this is my life. Because as we know, the things that we do are the most important things to us, and we take them very seriously, which is great. But from the standpoint of time sensitivity, sometimes the individual contributors overestimate how time sensitive a process may be. And so having that management perspective can be helpful. Now, as you're going through and looking at this, one of the cautions you have to look at, and we ask this very directly to our clients, is if management is in the room, does that stifle conversation? We know that sometimes culturally, when a manager or a senior manager or vice president is in the room, everybody looks to them for their direction. And so people won't answer the question, or they won't bring up input if a certain level or individual is in the room. So that does need to be balanced, because we have had cases where the management focus was, this is a 4-day, 5-day process, not a problem. It can come up later. But then as we'll work with the people who are on the ground running, and they start talking about really what they're doing, how they're interacting with customers, and the impact, it becomes very clear that no, that isn't true. It needs to be maybe more in the 24-hour range. And even the management representatives come back with some better understanding of what's really going on. So that mix is really, really important. However, that being said, you don't necessarily need to have a representative from every sub-function that's going on. If you get more than 4 or 5 people in a room, all of a sudden groupthink can take on, or the discussion can go into the weeds very quickly, and the facilitator of the process is going to need to make sure it comes up and it doesn't get into discussions that are more business process impacts and the problems that are going on, as opposed to the impact to the organization. And that's one of the risks that happen depending on the participants, is all of a sudden you start getting, this turns into a, here are the problems in the organization, not a, here's the impact to the process function. So consider, depending on the culture of the organization, and you may, as you get into the sessions, realize up front that, wow, having everybody in the room isn't working, and you may have to consider having 2 different conversations, one with the management team, one with the more individual contributors, or those that are specifically responsible for the process, and make sure that then you can kind of come together on a consensus. Any comments or thoughts on that? Are there any questions as it relates to participants? Because this is really, from an efficiency perspective, this is one of the items that can really help you keep the process tight and effective, because you're not having to overly manage the conversation. Okay. Okay, so now what you're going to do is you're going to develop a questionnaire for either the questionnaire BIA, or as a pre-interview to do some data gathering so you can be prepared. And what we've got here is just an example of that, right? You might have who the department is and who the people are going to participate, and then you'll kind of have the critical processes that you're going to discuss. Having them fill out the applications and kind of extra equipment that are needed, any kind of regulatory, or do they think there are workarounds available if systems aren't available, is really helpful. Also, we like to put on kind of standard equipment and standard, applications, email, Office, or whatever your work, your Office productivity suite may be, right? You know that your company always has, an X and a Y drive you can kind of put on there. So those can already be prepped and ready to go, as opposed to having to go through them every single time and discuss and bring them up in the discussion. So this really allows it to be a lot more efficient. The better this information is filled in, really the more efficient the BIA ends up being, and you can spend the time digging into some of the other details that does require investigation and discussion. I can tell you that in our experience, this is hit or miss for folks. If you get it ahead of time and let people spend a little bit of time, a week or so ahead of their interview, that really helps. If you try to have it done, 2 or 3 days before their interview, it probably will not get filled in. One of the other problems is it does get filled in, but then you end up getting it, the day before the interview, and you don't have time to digest it. But it is helpful, and it allows you as the facilitator or whoever is doing that to become a little bit familiar with what is happening and kind of be prepared for further discussions. The other thing that we'll do is we'll start helping to identify any potential inconsistencies, in information, or follow-up that people will want to start looking at. For example, if a process comes back and says we don't have any systems, you're going to have to spend a little bit more time discussing, well, what does that mean? What do you do? Because we know that most processes require some type of system, whether it's a file share or something. So that can be very helpful. From an interviewing process perspective, really set those expectations up front. You take 3 or 4 minutes to talk about what the process is going to be, how you're going to go about it, the discussion rules. Are you going to have some type of cue, like knocking on the table if the discussion is kind of going down a rat hole, if you will. Also helping people understand from an expectation perspective that the first process may actually take longer. We'll tell folks that the first process may take 20 to 25 minutes, and then the subsequent processes after that, from an interview perspective, will only take 5 to 10. That way, when you've spent 30 minutes, the people are looking at it saying, oh my gosh, I've got 7 processes we have to do, and it's now 30 minutes, and they calculated we're going to be here 4 hours. They know up front, don't worry about it. We'll be able to knock out the other 5 much faster because you've gone through the pain and understanding of the first process. Also, that this is not necessarily a problem identification or a solutions or workaround identification process. It's just to understand, are they in place and what are the impacts? Trying to make it, and a lot of these issues, right, we'll often bring few snacks. It's amazing how a piece of chocolate or a piece of Lifesavers just kind of make it a little bit more comfortable for folks and lets them feel a little more comfortable. Also, take breaks as necessary, especially in a 2-hour session. It might make sense halfway through, get up, stretch, to do all of that so that people just aren't sitting. Make sure that the pre-work information is available and updated in whatever tool or questionnaire you're going to be using, and reviewing that data ahead of time so that you're familiar with it. Make sure folks understand the categories, what they mean, how they fit into the process, and examples, especially around RTO and RPO. Those are two concepts that get mixed, and people will think that they're the same thing. And so helping them understand how they relate to each other, and how these different categories that you leverage. For example, if you're looking at dollar versus non-dollar impacting categories, right? If you say, well, what's the revenue impact? And people can talk about that. And then you'll ask, well, what is the delay in billing and payments, for example? People will mix those together. They'll say, well, it's the same thing. It's like, well, it's not the same thing, right? Because lost revenue is you're never going to get that. Delayed revenue is something very different, right? And so if you're using that kind of concept, you have to remind folks throughout that lost revenue is you're never going to get the sale. Delayed revenue is you might not get that revenue for a week or 2 weeks, or delayed billing and payments is it's a service you've provided, but instead of getting the payment in 30 days, you're getting the payment in 60, 90, et cetera. What's the impact to the organization with that? So really understanding what those things mean and giving examples can be very helpful in moving the conversation along. If you can, having somebody who is skilled or used to facilitating to keep discussion moving and appropriate is very helpful, and having somebody else keep the notes. That's one of the things we find is you've got the scribe keeping track of everything and the other person facilitating. Sometimes we will have to do both, and it can be a little bit challenging trying to write down people's comments, especially as it relates to the why. Because as you present the facts to folks or to management, some of the questions will be, well, why is that a RTO 0, which is a 2-hour recovery time? Well, you can't use, well, because they said so. You can come back with, well, here are the reasons that were given. Here's the impacts of the process in the business. That's hard to do if you're facilitating as well as trying to keep notes. Also, it can be very helpful to have IT involved. In that process. And when we say IT on the process, that really isn't them telling folks what the RTOs and RPOs are, but it's there as a reference so if somebody has a question. And also having them listen to the business impacts is very important. I had a quick question from the chat. The question was, what's our view on recording the conversation? That can be a very good solution as long as everybody understands up front that it is being recording. The only issue with recording conversations is it may stifle some of the discussion, especially if there are concerns about issues coming up or depending on the culture of the organization. So I like it if you can do it because it's very easy to go back and remember what things are going on. And it does make efficiency a little bit easier because you can have one person doing things. But understand you may not get the data if people are there. Also, if you think about recording, you will get some crosstalk, and sometimes that can be hard to hear on the recording. So you'll just need to kind of take that into account as well. But yeah, that is a good a potential option, especially for a small group. The big groups, it doesn't work as well, but the small groups, it works very nicely as well. So great question. Any comments or thoughts or questions as it relates to kind of the process and anything maybe you've experienced or difficulties that we might be able to answer for you?
Richard, this is Bill Villalobos.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, what I've done in the past is project on a screen the questionnaire itself and capture real-time the responses from the participants so that everyone in the room can see what is being said, and we can, in real-time fashion, capture and verify what is being stated.
That's a great comment, and I will send you your $5 fee for kind of prepping my next comment, if you will, Bill. So no, that's really good, and that was going to be one of my next comments. So thank you for that. Yes, that is a very effective way to do things. We actually, and one of the things that MHA tries to do is we try to be agnostic to a lot of things. So I didn't want to necessarily get into all of our tools, but as Bill mentioned, we have a tool that we use online that's a SaaS-based BIA tool, and we project it up and capture the data in real time in order to do exactly what Bill mentioned. And the nice thing is it really helps people see the information, drive conversation, and I think Bill does something similar. Since full disclosure, I know Bill.
And we have worked in the past.
And we have worked in the past. But we also, our BIA tool will calculate RTOs and RPOs on the fly. So as soon as it's done, as soon as you're done with that process, you can look at it and say, this is scoring as a RTO 3 or an RTO 0, and it does that. So Bill, I appreciate that. That's a very, very good suggestion. Are there any other comments or questions kind of about the process in and of itself? Okay. I want to make sure I didn't skip a thing. So make sure that you go through the integration and the dependencies. Don't ignore those. That's probably one of the most important things that you get, because this can really show where there's an inconsistency in RTOs. Less so RPOs, because the RPOs are going to be based on data loss for a process. And so, for example, if you have an ERP, the ERP might be used in for purchasing, and the purchasing department is relatively easy for them to recreate data. But if that same ERP is being used in a large supply chain organization, they can't lose data. And so, by definition, whoever gets the lowest RPO wins, and that's where your RPO comes out. But from a BIA perspective, this can help from an RTO inconsistency. So if you have a supply chain organization has a very low RTO, say a 4-hour RTO because you're a near real-time organization, and they're dependent on the purchasing department, and there's often needs to direct receipts coming in. And the purchasing department says, we're 3 to 5 days, no big deal. Well, now you've got some dependencies that you might look at and say, well, wait a second, if you're not around, that impacts the supply chain, and they need to be around up in 4 hours. If you're not around for 5 days, what's that going to do? It may be right, but at least it drives some conversations, because maybe purchasing moves from 3 days to 24 hours, because the supply chain team can deal with it for 24 hours, but not 3 to 5 days. So that's a real important piece. Also, externally, because we're becoming more dependent on our external vendors, understanding that and then being able to leverage them in the future, or leverage what their capability is very important. The data synchronization state, and as we kind of talked about, hard copy records, there's really more of them than you probably think. It's amazing to find out what people really are doing, and it actually may drive other issues that you need to deal with. But one thing about dependencies is you will probably find there are more dependencies than really initially identified. And so as you've kind of gone through the discussion, it will trigger some questions that might come up about different types of dependencies. They may say, we're not dependent on anybody. Well, that's almost impossible. And so as you've talked about the impacts to the business, and they talked a little bit about the processes, it will help you drive those dependencies as well. Don't focus on technology, because the BIAs are not about technology. They're a result of the BIA. RTOs will map to technology. They won't necessarily drive and should not necessarily drive the RTO. If technology is driving the RTO, that probably means IT is telling everybody, well, this is how quick we can recover, and so processes fall into that RTO, as opposed to saying, this is really how quickly we need to be functional again. And as we kind of mentioned, RPO is really the technology matrix of data loss. So now, the one comment I will make is, one of the things that you can do is, if you can't do it really by process, some folks will do a application impact analysis, where they will look at the applications and kind of go through the various departments and understand how important those are. That's really a secondary analysis that can be done, but really is very different from a BIA. So now that we've gotten all of that information, what do we do? What's the whole point? So we've got this great information on criticality of processes, et cetera, et cetera. And some of these are probably very obvious. But this is really now a state where we can leverage the gaps in our business relocation strategy, in our data centers. What is our technology strategy in reality? And this goes back to the RTO versus RTA and the RPO versus RPA, which again is why it's important to have IT there. As you're sitting there discussing, if they start seeing that, wow, we're starting to see a lot of these processes need to be available in 12 hours, and the vast majority of the applications that are associated with those processes are a backup and restore and a rebuild the server from scratch. There's no way you're going to have that done in 12 hours in most cases. Or they may see that we're over-architected. That isn't a bad thing necessarily, but it can be a more expensive solution. But again, as I want to emphasize, IT shouldn't be determining these. And we've sat in BIAs where people will say, I don't know why I'm here. Our IT has already said, this is what we're gonna be up in 24 hours. Like, well, that's great. That's what IT is saying they're capable of doing. What we need to understand is, what do we think is really needed? Then that helps drive IT. I shouldn't say drive IT. It helps us as an organization make appropriate technology strategy changes or decisions going forward. The other thing that is helpful, and I should have said this as we were going through the interview, is we also will tell people that your RTO does not necessarily mean you get that in 6 months. Especially when people start saying, hey, we want to have a zero downtime. Great. And I'll jokingly say, do you have a $2 to $3 million budget? And they'll gulp and we'll say, because that's what it's going to cost in order to do that. And then we'll talk about what this really means. So these technology strategies based on the RTOs, it does help going back and forth with our business partners and to make sure everyone understands saying it is one thing, paying for it is another. These also help in our business continuity plans, and I think that's obvious, but sometimes it doesn't happen because we'll look at business continuity plans and they'll be based on long recoveries, when in actuality, we need to have shorter recoveries, and maybe there are some workarounds that actually do need to be put in place because of the criticality of the process. Some of the dependencies is really key. You can start building some of those dependencies into these BIAs. And probably just as important as anything is what technologies are needed while the base applications and systems are being recovered. What if they aren't available? And a good example of that is phone capability. So if you're running a VoIP solution and it's running in your data center and your data center goes down, what are you going to do about phones? You got to do something. What about file sharing? And just from a business continuity perspective, I was talking with an organization and they said, we're going to put all of our business continuity plans on SharePoint. I said, that's a really good solution. You just realized that SharePoint is now a highly available, never down solution, right? And they went, well, no, we can bring it up in 24 hours. And I said, but how are you going to pull your plans out in order to recover the thing that you need to recover? And the light bulb went on. And so sometimes your business continuity plans will now drive some other technologies that you leverage. Critical vendors. This is kind of what we were talking about, is now identifying how important some of those third parties are, and making sure that you can go to them and make sure that their business continuity solutions matches yours. And that's becoming more and more important. You may be okay with that. You may perform a vendor analysis. But those critical vendors, we're finding that these BIAs are really identifying those, and it's bringing that level of attention up in organizations. So what are you going to do now? When was your last BIA? If it's over a year, you probably want to update it in some form or fashion. You really want to review your RTOs and RPOs by process, and then look at the technology that's related to that. Are they close? Are they correct? As you work with your IT partners, where are they at? What can they actually do? That would be kind of our first recommendation for you. And just kind of a final thought, one of the things that, this is a Steve Jobs thing. I'm not a Steve Jobs disciple, if you will, but I think this quote is great, is simple can actually be harder than complex. And so as you spend some time working to make these BIAs more effective, simpler, easier, it's going to be worth it in the end, because then you're going to get a lot of really great information. So with that, we've got some other things coming up, but let me take everybody off of mute. And are there any questions that I want to make sure we end on time. So really appreciate you taking the time. Comments or questions?
Before then, I want to try and get as much of that unneeded data out of LDRPS as I possibly.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time, spending this with us. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. The presentation will be sent to you for those of you that have registered. The recording is available. And again, really do appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully there was some good, at least a couple pieces of information that was helpful. We'll stay on for another couple minutes in case there are any questions or anybody wants to have a discussion as well. So thanks very much, and I hope you have a good rest of the day.